The first bullet missed Corporal Jack Mercer's head by less than 2 inches. It punched a hole through the bark of the oak behind him, showering his cheek with splinters. The second bullet wasn't far behind. He heard it hiss past like an angry bee, and by the time the third one cracked, he was already throwing himself into the muddy trench, boots skidding on the frost-slick earth. "Jesus Christ!" Private Lenny Burns shouted beside him, fumbling with his helmet strap. "They're already on us." Jack didn't answer. He jammed the butt of his M1 Garand into his shoulder and peered over the lip of the trench. The hedgerow line 40 yards ahead was alive with muzzle flashes, German machine guns, MG-42s. Their chatter was unmistakable, like a buzzsaw tearing through the cold November air of 1944. The fields outside the Belgian village were flat and unforgiving, no cover but a few shell craters and frozen fence posts. If those Krauts pinned them here, they'd chew the platoon apart before breakfast. "Down," Sergeant Rivas barked from a few yards away. "They've got the road zeroed, keep your heads low and return fire." Jack wiped his face with a shaking hand, realized it wasn't water but blood from a nick on his cheek. He ignored it. He had bigger problems. He slid up onto his knees, exhaled once and sighted down the iron sights. 3 figures darted behind a stone wall beyond the hedgerow. He squeezed the trigger once. Crack. The Garand bucked against his shoulder, smooth and familiar. He fired again. Crack. 2 rounds in 3 seconds. The third round took one of the Germans in the shoulder and spun him around like a rag doll. "Holy hell, Mercer on it!" Lenny yelled, shoving a fresh en-bloc clip into his Garand with shaking fingers. "Less cheering, more shooting," Jack growled back, but a corner of his mouth twitched upward. The rifle felt good in his hands. It always had. When the world exploded around him, the Garand was the one thing he could trust to do exactly what he needed. "Machine gun nest left side behind that cart," someone shouted. Jack shifted, saw it immediately. A wooden farm cart overturned against a wall. Behind it, 2 Germans with an MG-42 were cutting the road to pieces. One of the rounds ripped through Private Harker's leg as he tried to crawl across open ground. Harker screamed, clawing at the frozen mud. "Cover me," Jack barked, already hauling himself out of the trench. "Are you nuts?" Lenny shouted. "Just cover me." Jack sprinted low, boots slapping the cold mud. Bullets cracked around him. He dove into a shell crater halfway across the field, gasping for breath. He could hear Harker moaning ahead, blood spreading in a dark pool under his thigh. Jack clenched his jaw, raised the Garand, and fired 3 quick shots at the machine gun's flash. The gun fell silent for half a second, enough for Rivas and 2 others to open up from the trench. One of the Germans ducked, wrong move. Jack's 4th shot caught him clean. "Move, Harker, crawl," Jack shouted. "I can't," Harker whimpered. His face was pale, lips already blue. Shock. He was going into shock. Jack gritted his teeth, pulled a smoke grenade from his belt, yanked the pin, and hurled it ahead of them. Thick gray plumes spread across the field. He didn't wait. He scrambled out of the crater, grabbed Harker under the armpits, and dragged him back through the mud. Harker screamed the whole way, but at least he was breathing. Lenny's voice echoed behind the smoke. "Come on, Jack, come on." Jack stumbled into the trench just as another burst from the MG-42 shredded the smoke where he'd been seconds earlier. He dumped Harker into Doc Mason's arms. The medic was already digging into his kit. "He's lost a lot of blood," Doc muttered. "I'll do what I can." Jack's hands shook as he slammed another clip into his rifle. The ping of the empty clip ejecting was oddly comforting, like a bell marking the beat of life and death. "Mercer," Rivas barked. The sergeant crouched low, helmet smeared with mud, eyes sharp. "I need you and Burns on the right flank. We take out that gun or we're corpses by noon." Jack spat mud from his mouth. "Got it." Lenny's face was pale but determined. "Lead the way, hero." They climbed out of the trench again, keeping low, moving through the ditch line toward the hedgerow's right flank. The ground crunched under their boots, frost cracking like bones. German bullets still stitched the trench line, but their angle was bad on this side. That gave them a sliver of a chance. They reached the edge of the hedgerow. Jack raised 2 fingers. Lenny nodded. They crept forward until Jack could see the cart clearly. The remaining German gunner was reloading, fumbling with the belt of ammo. Another soldier with a Kar 98K shouted something in German and waved his arms, pointing toward the flanking Americans. Their cover was blown. "Now," Jack hissed. Both men opened up. The Garand spat fire in Jack's hands, each shot clean, fast, 8 rounds in seconds. One German jerked back, a dark stain blooming across his parka. Lenny hit the gunner and the MG-42 clattered from his hands. The surviving soldier threw down his rifle and raised his hands, shouting something Jack didn't understand. For a second, the world narrowed to the sound of the man's labored breathing, the wind across the hedgerow, and the hot pulse of adrenaline pounding in Jack's ears. Lenny lowered his rifle slightly. What do we do with him? Jack didn't answer right away. Part of him wanted to let the MPs handle it. Part of him thought about Harker bleeding out in the trench. And another part, the darker part that war carved into every man, whispered that it would be easier to end it right here. He tightened his grip on the rifle. The German looked terrified. Young, maybe 20, Jack hated that. Get up, Jack finally said. Hands on your head, move. They marched the prisoner back toward the trench, rifles trained on him. Rivas met them halfway, eyes scanning. Good work, that gun had us pinned to hell. Baker's squad is pushing left, we might actually clear this village. Jack nodded but said nothing. His heart was still hammering. He couldn't stop seeing the kid's face. That wasn't the first prisoner he'd ever taken, but each one left a mark. A reminder of the line between pulling the trigger and choosing not to. Harker was unconscious when they passed him. Doc was still working, blood all over his gloves. Jack forced himself to keep moving. If he stopped to feel it all now, it would drown him. Mercer, Captain O'Connell's voice rang out as he climbed over the trench line, field jacket flapping in the wind. You and your boys just opened a hole in their line. We push now or we lose the momentum. Sir, they've got at least one more MG nest deeper in, Rivas warned. Then we take it, O'Connell snapped. Baker and Charlie squads will flank left, you go straight through the road. We've got tank support coming up, but it's slow in this mud, you move fast. Jack caught Rivas's eye. The sergeant didn't need to say anything. They both knew what that meant. They were the spear tip again, first in, first shot at dying. Burns, Mercer, point team, Rivas ordered. Let's move. Jack climbed over the trench, breath puffing in the cold air. The village lay ahead, gray stone houses clustered like old bones. Smoke curled from chimneys. Somewhere inside, Germans waited, but so did the end of this ambush. They moved quickly, boots slapping mud, rifles at the ready. The Garand's weight was familiar, almost comforting, like a trusted friend who didn't lie. Jack scanned the upper windows. Movement flickered. A figure with a rifle. Jack didn't hesitate. He fired once. The man toppled backward. Lenny let out a shaky laugh. You're a machine, Jack. Keep your head down, Jack muttered. They reached the first house. Rivas signaled. Jack kicked the door open, sweeping left. Lenny swept right. The kitchen was empty except for a dead chicken on the floor and a pot still simmering on the stove. Civilians had either fled or were hiding. They cleared the next room, then climbed the stairs. A German soldier burst out from a bedroom, swinging his rifle like a club. Jack rammed his shoulder into the man's chest, knocking him against the wall. They struggled, the Garand wedged between them. Jack smelled sweat, gun oil, blood. His knee slammed into the German's thigh, then he shoved the barrel up under the man's chin. The German froze, hands trembling. Jack's finger hovered over the trigger. His heart thudded like a drum. It would be so easy. But the man dropped his weapon. Get down, Jack rasped, face down. Lenny cuffed him with his rifle butt and zip-tied his wrists with a strap. 2 prisoners in one morning. Lucky day, Jack thought grimly. Outside, the battle raged. Explosions echoed down the street, a tank engine growled somewhere behind them, and the sharp crack of Garands filled the air, fast, relentless. Jack knew the Germans were used to slower rifle fire. They couldn't believe how fast GIs could pour rounds downrange. It gave the Americans an edge, and right now they needed every edge they could get. Mercer, Burns, Rivas's voice bellowed from below. Let's go, we're pushing deeper. They left the house, sprinting down the main road. A Sherman tank rumbled up behind them, its treads chewing through the mud, its guns swiveling toward the center square. German fire rattled against its hull like rain on tin. As they reached the square, the Germans made their stand. 2 MG-42s in sandbag positions, riflemen scattered behind walls, grenades already flying. Jack dove behind a stone fountain, mud splashing his face. Lenny skidded in beside him, cursing. Jesus, it's a meat grinder, Lenny gasped. Jack peeked around the edge. It was worse than he thought. Open ground, no cover except the fountain. The tank would help, but it was already taking hits from a Panzerfaust somewhere up the street. They needed to neutralize those guns fast or they'd be shredded. Rivas, Jack shouted, they'll cut us to pieces if we charge straight in. Then we don't, Rivas growled. Mercer, you flank right, Burns with him, I'll draw their fire. Jack didn't argue, he scrambled along the fountain, heart hammering. Lenny was right behind him, face slick with mud and sweat. They crawled through a side alley, stepping over broken glass, plaster, and a dead chicken that stank like hell. Gunfire echoed all around, loud and close. Jack reached the end of the alley and peeked out. One MG nest was just around the corner, the gunner's back to them as he poured fire into the fountain. Jack raised the Garand, exhaled, and fired 3 rounds fast. The gunner jerked forward, slumping onto his weapon. His assistant swung around, but Lenny dropped him before he could fire. 2 down, Lenny whispered, voice shaking with adrenaline. Jack grabbed a grenade, yanked the pin, and lobbed it toward the second nest across the square. The explosion was deafening. When the smoke cleared, the second gun was silent. Rivas and the rest of the squad surged forward, pouring fire into the last pockets of German resistance. The tank roared, its cannon belching fire and steel. Within minutes, the square was theirs. Jack collapsed against the wall, chest heaving, rifle hot in his hands. The world smelled of cordite, smoke, and mud. Lenny dropped beside him, laughing breathlessly. Still alive, Lenny said. Yeah, Jack muttered, staring at the Garand in his lap. For now. Rivas approached, helmet tilted back, eyes hard but proud. Good work, Mercer. Burns, you two just saved half this platoon. Jack didn't answer. He was looking at the bodies across the square. German, American, too many faces, some young, too young. The adrenaline was fatting and the weight was settling in again. That cold, heavy feeling that followed every fight. Hey, Lenny said softly, nudging him. We made it. Jack nodded, but in his gut he knew this was only the beginning. They won the square, but the Germans weren't done, not by a long shot. And tomorrow or the day after they'd be pushing forward again into another village, another field, another wall of fire. For now, though, he let himself breathe, just once. The sky above was gray, the kind of gray that promised more snow. Somewhere down the street he could hear the soft, metallic ping of Garand clips hitting the cobblestones as soldiers reloaded. That sound, he thought, meant they were still alive. And that would have to be enough. For today, snow started falling before dawn. It didn't come down in gentle flakes like postcards back home, but in thin, biting needles carried by a wind that cut through wool coats and skin like glass. Corporal Jack Mercer lay on his back inside the bombed-out shell of a bakery, staring at the rafters above him. His boots were soaked, his fingers numb despite his gloves, and his rifle rested across his chest like a sleeping dog he dared not set down. Mercer, Sergeant Rivas whispered from the window, breath fogging in the cold air. Get up, eyes open. Jack sat up, pulling his collar tighter around his neck. His back popped. He hadn't really slept, just drifted somewhere between exhaustion and alert panic like everyone else in the platoon. Outside, the world was a palette of gray and white. The village they'd bled for last night was quiet, too quiet. You think they're coming? Jack asked, sliding over to the window. Rivas didn't take his eyes off the tree line a few hundred yards down the road. I'd bet my last cigarette on it. The Germans had fallen back when the Americans took the square, but no one believed they were gone for good. The 352nd Infantry Division had been spotted all along this sector. They'd regroup overnight, and when they came back, they wouldn't do it gently. The church bell tower to the north was their observation point now. Jack could just make out Private Lenny Burns up there with a pair of binoculars, muttering curses into the wind. You ever wonder why the hell we're freezing our balls off in some Belgian village no one back home can even pronounce? Jack muttered. Rivas smirked without looking at him. Because the Kraut started this thing and somebody's gotta finish it, and apparently that somebody's us. Jack huffed a humorless laugh and checked his Garand's chamber. 8 rounds, clean, ready. He liked the way the rifle felt, solid, dependable. In a world where everything could go to hell in seconds, the Garand was the one thing that always answered back. A whistle blew softly from the bell tower. One short, one long, Lenny's signal, movement in the trees. Rivas's face tightened. Here we go. They moved fast, word spreading along the platoon's foxholes and ruined houses. Men rolled out of their bedrolls, pulled on helmets, slammed clips into rifles. The tank that had helped them take the square sat at the end of the street, its engine idling low, crew smoking nervously. The cold made everything sharper, the smell of gun oil, the crunch of boots, the click of metal. Jack took position behind a low stone wall at the edge of the square with Private Mason, The platoon medic crouched nearby, wrapping his hands around a canteen of lukewarm coffee. "Any idea how many?" Jack asked. Mason tilted his head toward the bell tower. "Lenny says a lot, trucks, probably infantry." "Fantastic," Jack muttered. The first sound wasn't gunfire, it was engines, the low, throaty growl of German trucks crawling through the mist. Then came boots, hundreds of them. Jack swallowed, throat dry. His heart didn't pound wildly, it was slow and heavy like a drum in the dark. Rivas crawled up behind the line. "We hold here, let them walk into it, fire on my signal." The men nodded. No one made jokes now, they'd been through enough to know what was coming. Shapes appeared in the mist, shadows at first, then forms. German infantry in greatcoats, helmets glinting in the weak light, rifles at the ready. Jack could see the frost puffing from their mouths as they advanced. The bastards were calm, organized. "Closer." Jack's finger rested on the trigger. His breath fogged the barrel of his rifle. He could smell the mud, the iron in the air, his own sweat. Rivas raised his hand. The first German officer raised binoculars. Rivas dropped his hand. The world exploded. Garand's barked all along the line, fast and sharp. Jack's rifle kicked into his shoulder as he squeezed off round after round, working the sights like second nature. One German dropped in the road, then another. The Garand's rhythm was fast, brutal, 8 shots in seconds. The Germans faltered under the hail of fire, their neat lines stumbling. Machine guns on both sides joined in. A German MG-42 screamed from somewhere in the fog, bullets chewing through stone and glass. A round ricocheted inches from Jack's head, showering him with gravel. He ducked, slapped a new clip into his rifle, and popped back up. "Jesus, they brought half of Germany," Mason shouted over the gunfire. Jack fired again, the Garand ping-ing as the clip ejected. "Then we send M back." The tank roared to life, its cannon belching fire. The shell tore through the fog, slamming into one of the German trucks. The explosion lit the field, sending men flying. Jack heard screams he couldn't understand, didn't want to. More Germans poured in. Grenades landed near the road. Dirt and snow erupted skyward. Jack's ears rang, his nose filled with the acrid taste of gunpowder. "Mercer," Rivas barked. "Right flank's thinning out, take Burns and shore it up." Jack nodded, ducked low, and sprinted through the smoke and rubble toward the right flank. Lenny was already there, firing from behind a broken wagon. His cheeks were flushed red from the cold, his hands steady. "About time," Lenny shouted as Jack slid in beside him. "I was starting to think you died in your beauty sleep." Jack grinned despite the chaos. "Miss me that much?" "Shut up and shoot." They both leaned over the wagon and opened fire. Germans were trying to push through the narrow alley. Jack shot one in the chest, then another in the leg. Lenny lobbed a grenade. The alley lit up like a furnace. "Flanking," Lenny yelled suddenly. Jack whipped around. 2 Germans had slipped through a side door, trying to hit their line from the rear. He barely had time to raise his rifle. The first man fired and missed. Jack didn't. His shot took the German clean through the chest. The second man dropped his weapon and raised his hands, shouting in panicked German. Lenny froze for a fraction of a second. That was all it took for another German further back to fire. Lenny jerked, hit in the shoulder, and went down hard. "Lenny!" Jack roared. He fired back blindly, hit the shooter, then dragged Lenny behind the wagon. Blood soaked through his jacket. Lenny's face was pale, lips trembling. "I'm fine," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Just a scratch." Jack ripped his jacket open. It wasn't a scratch. The bullet had torn deep. He pressed his hand down on the wound. Lenny screamed. "Doc!" Jack bellowed. "I need Doc." Mason was already sprinting toward them, skidding on the frozen mud. He dropped to his knees, ripped open his bag, and worked fast. Jack stayed pressed against the wagon, firing in short bursts to keep the Germans at bay. "Don't you dare die on me," Jack hissed at Lenny. Lenny forced a grin, pale as snow. "I'll haunt your ass if I do." Mason worked silently, his gloves soaked in blood, his jaw clenched. "He needs morphine, he's not dying yet, but we've gotta get this bleeding under control." Jack nodded, fired another burst, and felt the heat of his rifle barrel now. The Garand was singing fast, relentless. The Germans kept coming, but their momentum was cracking. American rifles hammered them faster than they could reload. A whistle blew again, this time from the German side. Their advance shifted. 2 mortars started thumping in the fog. Rounds fell around the square, tearing chunks out of the road. One landed close enough to blow Jack off his feet and slam him into a wall. His ears rang like a bell. The world tilted. Snow and dirt fell like ash. He staggered up, spitting blood. His hands found his rifle, still there, thank God. Mercer, Rivas shouted from somewhere in the smoke. Fall back to the church, they're bringing armor. Jack squinted through the fog. Sure enough, he could see the dark, hulking silhouette rolling out of the trees, a German half-track with a mounted MG. Lenny, Jack barked. But Mason had already dragged him back toward the church. Jack sprinted after them, firing over his shoulder. Bullets chased him down the street. They crashed through the church doors, slamming the heavy wood shut behind them. Inside, the platoon was rallying. The pews were shoved into barricades, the altar cracked from shelling. Snow drifted in through holes in the roof. The tank outside repositioned, its crew shouting. They're not stopping, Mason panted, tying a tourniquet around Lenny's arm. They're really not stopping. Jack knelt next to Lenny. His friend's breathing was shallow but steady. You hold on, Burns, we've still got a war to win. Yeah, Lenny rasped. Yeah, I'm not missing the next cigarette. Outside, the German half-track opened up. The church walls shuddered as bullets chewed through stone. The tank answered back with a deafening roar. Men shouted orders. Someone screamed. The fight was tightening around them like a noose. Mercer, Rivas barked. Up top, bell tower, take the shot at that gunner before they shred the whole line. Jack didn't hesitate. He climbed the narrow stone stairs 2 at a time, lungs burning, rifle slung tight. Snow and cold air flooded in from the shattered top of the tower. The view punched the breath out of him. The fog was clearing just enough to reveal the German line advancing, rows of infantry behind the half-track, more trucks rolling up. He lay flat against the cold stone floor, steadied his breathing, and sighted the Garand on the gunner. Wind cut through the broken glass, making his fingers ache. He waited for the right beat, inhale, exhale, squeeze. The shot cracked sharp. The gunner's head snapped back and he toppled from the mounted MG. Chaos rippled through the German line as they scrambled to fill the gap. Nice shot, Rivas yelled from below. Jack worked fast, reload, fire, fire. The Garand's rhythm was his heartbeat. Each shot bought them seconds, each second was life. Then he saw it, a German soldier crawling forward with a Panzerfaust, aiming at the Sherman tank outside the church. Jack swore under his breath. He shifted, lined up the sights and fired. Missed. The man kept crawling. He fired again. This time the man's head snapped forward and the launcher clattered to the ground. Tank safe, Jack shouted. But they were still outnumbered. Mortar fire chewed the road and German infantry spread out, probing the flanks. The tank was powerful but slow in this mud. If they surrounded it, they'd be done. Rivas climbed up partway. They're trying to push around the left side. I need you down there, Mercer. Jack nodded, slung the rifle, and clattered down the stairs. He burst out the side door of the church, sliding behind a burned-out jeep. Snow and dirt sprayed around him as he returned fire. He could hear the tank's engine growling, the Garands of his squad hammering back at the German advance. It was chaos, loud, dirty, brutal chaos. Grenade, someone screamed. Jack dove. The blast hit like a sledgehammer, tossing him into the mud. His ears rang, his vision blurred. He tasted blood, but he pushed up, teeth clenched, grabbed his rifle and kept firing. A German soldier rushed the line. Jack didn't think. He slammed the butt of his Garand into the man's face, felt bone crunch, then drove the bayonet home. Warm blood spilled on the snow. Jack staggered back, chest heaving. No time to process, he just moved. The tank fired again. The half-track exploded in a roar of flame and steel. A cheer rose from the Americans, ragged but fierce. But the Germans weren't giving up. They regrouped, firing from doorways and rubble. The battle narrowed to brutal, yard-by-yard fighting. Jack fired until his shoulder burned. His hands were raw, his ears were useless. Then silence, not total but enough. The Germans were pulling back, fading into the fog they'd come from, trucks revering, boots fatting, a few scattered shots, then nothing but the hiss of snow. Jack collapsed against the church wall, sliding down until he sat in the cold mud. His rifle lay across his lap, barrel steaming in the icy air. His breath came in shuddering gasps. Rivas limped over, helmet dented, face streaked with dirt. Hell of a morning. Jack laughed weakly, a sound that felt more like a cough. Yeah, real cheerful. Mason dragged Lenny out on a stretcher. His friend was pale, but his eyes fluttered open as they passed. You still alive, Burns? Jack asked. Lenny gave a tired grin. Yeah, you still ugly. Jack barked a short laugh and squeezed his shoulder gently. We held. Damn right we did, Rivas said, lighting a cigarette with hands that still shook. The snow kept falling, covering the bodies, the road, the spent shells. Everything looked clean again, but Jack knew better. The silence wasn't victory, it was a pause. They'd thrown back the Germans today, tomorrow might be worse, maybe armor, maybe artillery. But for now, they were alive. Jack glanced at the Garand resting against his knee. It was hot, dirty, scraped, but it had never failed him. Outside the ruined village, the fog thickened again, swallowing the tree line. Jack stared into it, feeling that familiar knot in his gut. They'd be back, and so would he. Snow was falling in thick, silent sheets when Daniel Cole jerked awake. For a split second he didn't know where he was, just a blur of pale sky, the crackle of distant gunfire, the thump of artillery echoing like thunder somewhere beyond the tree line. Then it hit him. Ardennes, the Bastogne perimeter. The foxhole was shallow, half-frozen, a miserable trench barely wide enough to turn around in. His hands were numb inside his gloves, his breath fogging the frigid air. Simmons sat opposite him, hunched over, pulling his greatcoat tighter. His rifle leaned against the wall of packed snow and dirt, its barrel crusted with frost. You slept, Simmons muttered, his voice rasping. That's new. Daniel rubbed his face, feeling the sting of cold against his skin. Didn't mean to. Nobody means to anymore. The kid's smile was crooked, more a grimace than anything, but Daniel appreciated the effort. It was freezing. Supplies were low, half their unit had trench foot or worse. The Germans had surrounded them for days now. Above the tree line, the pale sky had just started to glow. Dawn, that meant the shelling would start soon. Daniel's stomach nodded. It had been 3 days since they'd seen a supply drop. 3 days since they'd eaten anything more than stale rations. 3 days of constant probing attacks, German infantry trying to test the line, push through, break the Americans before the 101st could get relief. They hadn't broken yet. A distant whistle cut through the stillness. Daniel froze. A heartbeat later, the world erupted. Artillery shells slammed into the forest line beyond, shaking the ground. Snow and mud exploded upward like geysers. Simmons flinched and grabbed his helmet. Daniel pushed himself down in the foxhole, clenching his jaw against the roar. Here we go again, he muttered. The shells came in waves. Each detonation thudded in his chest, louder and closer. Until dirt showered their hole and snow cascaded down their backs. The trees screamed as shrapnel tore through branches. Somewhere left of them, a man yelled, cut short by the next shell. Jesus, Simmons whispered. Keep your head down, Daniel barked. Don't look, just keep it down. The barrage lasted 3 minutes, 3 minutes of hell. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed felt almost louder. Then came the whistles. Daniel's blood went cold. That sound meant one thing, German infantry. Up, he hissed. They scrambled to the lip of the foxhole. Through the swirling snow, figures emerged from the tree-line, gray coats, helmets, rifles glinting faintly. The Germans moved fast and low, their boots crunching on the ice, their formation tight. Not a probing attack this time. This was a push. Wait for it, Daniel whispered. Simmons breathed through his teeth. His hands trembled slightly on the M1 Garand. Daniel didn't blame him. His own hands weren't much steadier. The Germans reached 50 yards, 40, 30. Now Daniel shouted. The M1 cracked. The Garand's distinctive metallic ping filled the air as Simmons fired rapidly, each shot snapping clean in the cold morning. Daniel squeezed off rounds 2, aiming center mass, working the rifle like it was part of his body. The front line of Germans went down hard. Men dropped into the snow, blood spraying like dark ink across white canvas. The line faltered, but only for a second. Then they returned fire. Bullets hissed overhead, slapping into snowbanks, spitting mud and ice into their faces. Daniel ducked, reloaded, popped up again. 2 moving right, Simmons yelled. I see M. Daniel swung and fired. One gray coat jerked backward and fell, the other scrambled for cover behind a frozen stump. Their foxhole shook as a grenade landed close. Daniel grabbed Simmons and yanked him flat. The explosion showered them with mud, but neither was hit. He didn't even pause to breathe before coming up again, firing on reflex. To his left, Sergeant Miller's squad joined in, machine gun fire rip. The second wave hit hard, grenades flew, mortar rounds thumped somewhere behind the German line. Daniel felt a hot sting in his arm, shrapnel. He gritted his teeth, ignored the pain. No time. One German soldier, barely older than Simmons, stumbled into the open, rifle shaking. Daniel shot him once. The kid spun and fell into the snow, blood staining the white ground. Daniel didn't feel anything, not guilt, not pride, just the cold. More Americans joined the defense. A .30 cal machine gun roared to life down the line, shredding the third German wave. The ground turned into a killing field, gray bodies dropping, snow churned into red slush. But still they came. Daniel slammed a fresh clip into his Garand and looked at Simmons. The kid's face was pale, smeared with mud and blood, but his eyes burned. "We're not letting them through," Daniel growled. Simmons spat, "Damn right." Another grenade landed close, too close. Daniel kicked it back over the lip of the foxhole on instinct. It exploded midair, showering them with dirt but sparing their lives. "Lucky bastard," Simmons muttered. Daniel just grinned through the grime. Or good. The German attack finally began to falter. Too many dead, too much firepower holding the line. A whistle blew somewhere in the distance, retreat. And just like that, they were pulling back into the tree line, dragging wounded, leaving their dead behind in the snow. For the first time in hours, silence returned. Daniel slumped against the frozen wall of the foxhole, chest heaving. His arm throbbed where shrapnel had torn through his sleeve. Blood seeped into his coat, hot against the cold. Simmons leaned back too, letting out a long, shaky laugh. "We lived." "Yeah," Daniel muttered, "for now." Miller climbed down into their hole, face streaked with soot. "Hell of a show you two put on, that was good work." Daniel shrugged, but inside, a flicker of pride burned. "Medics are moving down the line," Miller continued. "Get that arm checked out, we might not have time later." Daniel nodded, but his eyes were on the tree line. He couldn't shake it. The Germans hadn't thrown everything at them. That wasn't a full assault, that was a test. And tested follow-ups. As medics patched him up and Simmons dug into what little rations they had, Daniel felt the weight of it pressing down. The men were exhausted. Ammunition was running low. The snowstorm had only gotten worse. But the line had held, and as long as it did, Bastogne stood. That night they huddled in the foxhole under a tarp, listening to distant artillery. Simmons cracked a joke about how he was going to marry a French girl with a bakery once the war ended. Daniel laughed, not because it was funny, but because it kept the darkness out. Then came the whisper through the line. Scouts had picked up movement again, more troops massing in the forest, bigger guns, tanks. Daniel stared out into the blizzard, the flakes biting his face like knives. This was far from over. He didn't say it aloud, but he knew. Tomorrow would be worse. The night howled like a living thing. The wind screamed through the bare trees, scattering snow in swirling sheets across the foxholes. Daniel Cole pressed his shoulder against the frozen wall of the trench, his breath steaming in the darkness. The cold gnawed at everything. Skin, nerves, hope. The whisper came down the line, "Tanks." He heard it before he saw it, a low, steady rumble that grew from a distant tremor into something that rattled the earth. At first, it could have been thunder, but thunder didn't grind metal against metal. Thunder didn't echo through your bones like a heartbeat from hell. German armor. Simmons sat beside him, clutching his Garand like it was the last solid thing in the world. The kid's jaw was clenched tight, frost crusting his scarf and eyebrows. "They're bringing panzers," Simmons muttered. Daniel didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the tree line ahead. Through the blowing snow, faint yellow lights flickered, headlamps covered with slits to keep them dim. And then they emerged. A Tiger tank rolled through the forest like an iron god, its wide treads chewing through snow and mud, its long barrel cutting the night like a spear. Behind it came another, and another. Infantry trudged in their wake, gray uniforms blurring into the blizzard. "Jesus Christ," Simmons whispered. Miller appeared at the edge of their foxhole, his voice low and hard. Armor column 3 Tigers minimum infantry company behind M. Command says hold, no retreat, no fallback. Daniel stared at him, hold against Tigers with rifles and machine guns. Yeah, Miller said grimly, welcome to Bostonia. The company scrambled, bazooka teams hustled into position, mines were set on the road, men who hadn't eaten properly in days checked their ammo with shaking hands, no one needed a pep talk, everyone knew what was coming. The tanks rumbled closer, 20 meters, 15. The sound was unbearable now, a grinding roar that vibrated in Daniel's teeth. Simmons swallowed hard. You ever taken out a tank before? Daniel exhaled slowly. Once, North Africa will need to get close. Simmons gave a shaky laugh. Close to that thing, great. The first Tiger reached the minefield. For a moment Daniel thought the mines wouldn't work, the tank looked invincible. But then a thunderclap split the night as one track detonated, sending steel shards and snow high into the air. The massive machine lurched to the right, grinding to a halt. Hit M, Miller roared. The foxholes erupted with fire, Garand's cracked, .30 cals thundered. Bazookas streaked out in white arcs of smoke. One rocket slammed into the immobilized Tiger's side armor, not enough to penetrate but enough to shake the crew inside. German infantry hit the ground, returning fire in organized bursts. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. Muzzle flashes stuttered in the storm like lightning. Men shouted. Bullets cracked through the frozen air. Daniel fired until the clip pinged, reloaded, fired again. He didn't aim for the tanks, that was suicide. He aimed for the infantry creeping alongside them, dropping 1, 2, 3 Germans trying to flank. Left flank's moving, Simmons shouted. I see it. Daniel swung around, firing into the drifting snow where shadowy figures tried to advance. A grenade burst nearby, showering their hole with icy dirt. Another bazooka team hit the second Tiger's treads. The tank shuddered, slowed, but its turret swung toward the foxholes like an executioner turning its blade. Down, Daniel screamed. The 88mm shell ripped through the ground 10 meters away, exploding with a sound that drowned out everything else. The shockwave slammed Daniel into the frozen wall of the trench, knocking the breath out of him. Snow and dirt cascaded over them like an avalanche. Simmons coughed, half-buried. I hate tanks, he rasped. Yeah, Daniel gasped, pulling him upright. Me too. A whistle cut through the chaos, German officers rallying the infantry for another push. Daniel saw them advancing now, using the crippled tanks as cover. Clever bastards. Miller, Daniel shouted over the gunfire. We're gonna get overrun if they keep using those tanks as shields. Miller dove into their foxhole, face slick with grime and sweat. I know, bazookas are down to 2 rounds. Daniel's gaze locked on the first Tiger. Its left track was destroyed, smoke billowed from its engine compartment, but its hull machine gun still spat fire. Infantry hugged its flank like barnacles. We need to get behind it, Daniel said slowly. Get a shot into the engine block. Miller stared at him. That's suicide. Daniel adjusted his helmet, wiped blood from his cheek. Yeah. I'm coming with you, Simmons said without hesitation. Daniel shot him a look. You're staying here. Like hell I am? The kid's eyes were blazing now, not with fear but something harder. He'd been through the ambush, through Bostonia. He wasn't the kid from Normandy anymore. Miller clenched his jaw. If you're doing this, you've got 30 seconds before that tank fires again. Daniel grabbed a bazooka from the ammo crate, slung it over his shoulder and crawled out of the foxhole into the screaming blizzard. Simmons was right behind him. They moved low, keeping to the shadows, snow crunching under their boots. Bullets hissed overhead. The tank loomed like a black giant in the storm, its turret slowly rotating toward a machine gun nest down the line. Closer, closer. Daniel could feel the heat radiating from the tank's engine. He could smell the burning oil. He nodded at Simmons. The kid knelt, bracing the bazooka on his shoulder. Daniel slotted the rocket in, fingers numb from the cold. Ready, Daniel whispered. Simmons nodded. They fired. The backblast kicked snow into the air as the rocket slammed into the Tiger's rear hull. The explosion split the night. Fire burst from the engine deck in a geyser of flame. The turret froze mid-turn. Black smoke poured out of the top. Nice shot, kid, Daniel breathed. The Germans around the tank faltered, stunned by the sudden inferno. Daniel and Simmons didn't give them time to regroup. They opened fire, Garand's barking in rapid succession. More American fire joined from the line. The German assault began to unravel. Infantry scattered, some retreating toward the forest. The second Tiger fired again, blowing apart a section of trench, but its support was melting away. Then a sound cut through everything, engines, big ones. Daniel spun around. For a second he thought it was more German armor, but then he saw them, Shermans. The relief column had finally broken through. Sherman tanks rolled up the frozen road, guns swinging toward the tree line. Infantry followed close behind, their olive uniforms cutting through the storm like a green tide. The sound of their engines was the most beautiful thing Daniel had ever heard. The German line broke completely. Soldiers fled into the forest. One Tiger tried to reverse, slipped on the icy road, and a Sherman's 75 shell turned it into a fireball. The battlefield fell quiet except for the crackle of burning armor and the groans of the wounded. Daniel collapsed against the burning Tiger's flank, chest heaving. Simmons dropped next to him, laughing breathlessly. "We're still alive." Daniel looked at him and laughed too, raw and ugly. "Yeah, barely." Miller appeared, limping slightly, helmet crooked. "Hell of a move, Cole. Command's gonna love that." Daniel shook his head. "Command can shove it, I just want coffee." They laughed, not because it was funny, because they were alive, because laughing was the only thing left between exhaustion and collapse. Snow kept falling, soft and relentless, covering the wreckage of men and machines. Medics moved through the trenches, pulling out the wounded, tagging the dead. But they'd held Bostonia. That night, in a half-frozen foxhole under a tattered tarp, Simmons leaned back and whispered, "You know, I think I'll open a bar when this is over. Somewhere warm, no snow, no tanks." Daniel smirked, eyes half-closed. "Make sure they serve whiskey. Only the good kind." But as he drifted toward a restless sleep, Daniel couldn't shake the image of the German infantry retreating, not defeated but regrouping, pulling back to fight again. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. And tomorrow, the snow would fall just the same. The snow was turning to a wet gray slush by the time the push began. The wrecks of German tanks still smoldered on the edge of Bostonia, black scars against the white winter. Men shuffled through the mud, tired but moving. Orders were being shouted, rifles checked, Shermans lined up on the road like iron beasts waiting to be unleashed. Daniel Cole stood at the edge of the ruined tree line, steam rising from his soaked greatcoat. His hands were wrapped in damp bandages, the shrapnel wound on his arm, still throbbing with each heartbeat. He didn't care. He was going forward with his unit. Simmons came up behind him, helmet askew, his Garand resting on his shoulder. "They said we'd get 3 days rest after holding the line," he muttered. "Guess 3 hours was close enough." Daniel smirked despite the exhaustion dragging at his bones. "Army math. Army math sucks." "Yeah." Miller strode over, map clutched in a gloved hand, snow crusting his beard. "Listen up. Intel says the Krauts are pulling back east, but not far. There's a crossroads about 3 miles out. They're digging in there, probably setting up an artillery position. Our job is to punch through and take it before they can shell Bostonia again." Simmons exhaled sharply. "Of course they're digging in, why make it easy for us?" Miller jabbed a finger at the map. "Sherman's lead, we follow. Once armor engages their line, we flank left through the woods. No hero shit, no lone charges. We move together, clear them out, and hold that crossroads. If they get that position locked down, we'll be eating 88 shells for breakfast." Daniel nodded. He didn't need a speech. Everyone understood the stakes. The column moved out at dawn. Snow flurries whipped at their faces, wind slicing through wool and bone. The Shermans churned forward on the narrow, icy road, engines rumbling low. Behind them, the infantry trudged, rifles slung, boots crunching on frozen mud. The world smelled like smoke, metal, and war. Simmons walked beside Daniel, breathing through a scarf wrapped around half his face. "Remember Normandy?" he asked suddenly. "Yeah," Daniel said. "Back then I thought the worst thing in the world was getting shot at on the beach. I didn't know about snow, or sleeping in frozen mud, or tanks rolling over your foxhole at night." Daniel huffed out a tired laugh. "Yeah, we were dumb then. Still are." The road narrowed as the column entered a stand of blackened pine trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind through the branches, just the steady crunch of boots and the rumble of steel treads. Daniel's gut tightened. Miller moved up to the front, speaking quickly with the tank commander through the hatch. A few seconds later he returned, voice low, eyes up, we're close. They advanced another 200 yards, then the first shot came. A German 88 roared from somewhere ahead, the shell streaking through the trees like a comet. It slammed into the lead Sherman, blowing the track off in a spray of steel and flame. The tank lurched sideways, smoke billowing from its side. Contact front, someone yelled. Machine guns opened up from the tree line, tracers carved red lines through the snowy air, men dove for cover. Daniel hit the ground hard, sliding behind a stump, snow stinging his face. Ambush, Simmons shouted, firing blindly toward the muzzle flashes. Get off the road, Miller bellowed. They scrambled into the tree line as another 88 round screamed overhead. It hit the road behind the Shermans, tossing men into the air like rag dolls. Daniel slammed a fresh clip into his Garand, firing toward the shadows. Germans were dug in behind logs and snowbanks, well camouflaged, their fire disciplined and brutal. 2 o'clock, Simmons shouted, they've got an MG nest. Daniel leaned out just long enough to see it, a machine gun position chewing up the road. He ducked back as a burst snapped over his head. We need to take that out, he yelled to Miller. Miller, crouched behind a fallen tree, spat blood into the snow. You feel like volunteering, Cole. Daniel gave a short nod. Simmons glared at him, you're insane. Yeah, you coming? Of course I'm coming. They broke left, weaving between trees as bullets bit into the trunks around them. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. Each step felt like running through ice water, but they kept moving. The MG nest came into view. A pair of Germans hunkered behind a snowbank, barrel glowing red from sustained fire. Daniel signaled with 2 fingers. Simmons nodded, crept wide. Daniel tossed a grenade low. It landed just behind the nest. The explosion shredded the silence. Snow and wood chips flew in all directions. One gunner was blown clear, the other staggered, clutching his arm. Daniel finished him with a quick shot. The machine gun fell silent. That's one down, Simmons panted. More where that came from, Daniel muttered. All along the tree line, American infantry began pushing forward in small groups, using trees and shell holes for cover. The Shermans, now partially blocked, fired blind into the woods, their main guns lighting up the forest like thunderclaps. The Germans answered with mortars. Shells dropped into the snow with wet, brutal thuds. One hit 20 yards from Daniel, spraying him with earth and heat. Another hit closer and he heard men screaming. Keep moving, Miller roared from somewhere behind them. Daniel and Simmons pressed forward, firing at muzzle flashes. Their boots sank into wet snow, their hands raw from the cold. A German popped up from behind a log, rifle leveled. Daniel shot him once through the chest before the man could pull the trigger. Left, Simmons barked. Daniel spun, fired again. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, they broke through the tree line and saw it, the crossroads. A battered stone farmhouse sat at the intersection, its windows sandbagged. German machine guns chattered from the upper floor. A pair of 88s sat on either side of the road, shells stacked like bones. It was a fortress. Daniel pressed his back against a tree, breathing hard. They're dug in good. Simmons's teeth were chattering, not just from the cold. How the hell do we take that? Shermans hit the guns, we clear the house. Miller slid in beside them, face streaked with mud. Command wants it taken before nightfall. If they hold that crossroads overnight, they'll have more artillery here by morning. Daniel stared at the farmhouse. There was no clean way in, no safe way, but there wasn't time for safe. Smoke grenades, Daniel said. We lay a screen, push up the right side, breach through the wall, get in close before they cut us to pieces. Miller nodded once, do it. They moved fast. Smoke billowed across the road as Shermans thundered forward, guns blasting at the 88s. One German cannon went up in a fireball. The second fired once before a tank shell smashed through its shield. Daniel, Simmons, and 6 others sprinted low under the cover of smoke. Bullets hissed overhead, some blind, some not. One man went down screaming, clutching his leg. Daniel didn't look back. They reached the wall. The farmhouse loomed over them, pockmarked with bullet holes. Daniel pulled a satchel charge from his pack, slapped it against the lower wall, and ducked. The blast punched a hole through the stone. "Go!" Daniel yelled. They poured through the breach into hell. Germans were waiting inside, rifles and MP-40s barking. Daniel hit the floor, firing up at a figure on the stairs. The man dropped backwards, slamming into the railing. Simmons and two others cleared the lower room, moving like shadows between overturned tables and crates. Someone screamed upstairs. Daniel kicked open a door and almost walked into a German reloading behind a cabinet. They locked eyes for half a heartbeat. The German lunged. Daniel slammed the butt of his Garand into the man's face, felt bone give, then fired point blank. Upstairs, Miller barked. The staircase was narrow and slick with mud. Daniel led the way, Simmons on his heels. A burst of MP-40 fire ripped down from the landing. Daniel dove to the side, Simmons firing back. The German gunner fell, tumbling down the stairs. They burst into the upper floor. Two more Germans were setting up a machine gun in the window. Daniel fired before they could turn. The Garand pinged empty. Simmons finished the second man with a clean shot. And then silence. The last bursts of gunfire outside were dying down. American voices echoed through the smoke. The Shermans were still rumbling, their barrels glowing. Daniel lowered his rifle, chest heaving. The farmhouse was theirs. Outside, medics were dragging the wounded off the road. The crossroads was choked with black smoke and twisted metal, but the German line was broken. Simmons leaned against a shattered window, breathing hard. "We actually took it." Daniel wiped blood off his face with a dirty sleeve. "Yeah. Think this means they'll let us sleep tonight?" Daniel laughed, a low, tired sound. "Not a chance." Miller climbed the stairs, limping slightly. "We've got patrols sweeping the forest. Intel thinks this was just a holding force. Real units are falling back east, but we did it. Crossroads is secure." Daniel looked out over the battlefield. Smoke curled into the gray sky. Snowflakes fell gently, almost peaceful now that the gunfire was gone. Bodies lay scattered across the slush, German and American alike. "We held Bostonia," Miller said quietly, "and now we're pushing back." Simmons sank down onto a crate, helmet tipping forward. "Pushing back, God help us." Daniel didn't say anything. His eyes lingered on the tree line where the Germans had fled. This wasn't the end, it wasn't even close. Every inch they gained now would be paid for in blood. He tightened his grip on the Garand, feeling the weight of the steel. Tomorrow they'd keep moving. And the war would keep asking for more. The first light of dawn was a dull, gray bruise across the sky. Smoke from the crossroads still drifted upward, blending with the fog that clung low to the snow-covered ground. Daniel Cole sat on an overturned ammo crate, steam rising from his soaked boots. His rifle leaned against his knee. He hadn't slept, not really. He just stared into the cold until the sky changed color. Around him, the camp was silent except for the low mutter of men trying to keep warm and the distant creak of tank treads being serviced. Simmons was crouched beside a burning barrel, hands out over the flames. His cheeks were red, his eyes bloodshot. "You know," he muttered, "when they said winter in Europe, I thought it'd be, I don't know, white Christmas, hot chocolate, not whatever the hell this is." Daniel gave a tired snort. "You signed up for the army, not Santa's workshop." "Yeah, and the army never said anything about sleeping next to frozen corpses either." A medic walked past, a stretcher in his hands. They were still pulling out the dead from the tree line. The fight at the crossroads had been a win technically, but nobody felt victorious. The cost was too visible. Miller emerged from the command tent, a cigarette clamped between his teeth. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "Briefing," he barked. The men gathered around the map spread out on a crate. Miller pointed with a pencil. "We've got reports that the Krauts are regrouping east in the Ardennes Hills. HQ wants us to push through and hit their supply convoy before it reaches their main line. If they get those trucks through, we'll be staring down another artillery barrage by tomorrow night." "Convoy?" Simmons asked, voice rough. "Ammo, fuel, probably food. They're stretched thin, which means they're moving fast. We cut them off, we choke their counterattack before it starts." Daniel studied the map. A twisting forest road, hills on both sides, a frozen creek cutting through the middle. It screamed ambush territory. Miller must have read the doubt in his face. Yeah, I know, we'll be walking straight into the kind of place they love to bury us in, but we don't have a choice. How many trucks? Daniel asked. Intel says at least 8, maybe more. We've got 2 Shermans, 30 men and cold feet, that's all. Simmons muttered, this just keeps getting better. Move out in 20, Miller said. Travel light, no camp gear, just ammo, grenades and balls. They moved out as the sun finally broke through the fog, a weak, pale sun that offered no warmth. The forest ahead stretched like an endless wall of black trunks and white snow. The ground crunched under their boots and every sound carried too far. Daniel walked at the front, rifle ready, every sense stretched thin. The wind hissed through the branches like a whisper. Simmons trailed close behind him, his breath puffing in the cold. You ever think, Simmons murmured, that maybe one day we'll walk through a forest without expecting someone to shoot at us? Daniel didn't answer. They reached the ridgeline overlooking the forest road by midday. It was narrow and winding, flanked by trees on one side and a frozen creek on the other. Perfect choke point, perfect kill zone. Miller crouched down in the snow, studying the road through his binoculars. They'll come through here, no other way to the main route. We set up here, hit the lead and tail trucks and box them in. Daniel ran a gloved hand across the snow. They'll fight back hard. Miller lowered the binoculars, then we fight harder. The men spread out. Shermans were positioned behind a rise, their barrels angled down at the road. Riflemen fanned out along the tree line. Daniel and Simmons dug shallow firing positions behind fallen logs, snow seeping into their sleeves. They waited. And waited. Hours dragged by like cold molasses. Then Daniel heard it, faint at first, an engine's low growl, then more, a whole line of engines. Simmons whispered, showtime. The convoy rolled into view slowly, 8 trucks, a half-track in front, another in the rear, German soldiers riding on the sides, rifles slung. They looked tired, cold, unaware. Miller's voice crackled softly over the radio. Wait for it, wait. The lead truck crossed the kill zone, the tail entered. Now! The forest exploded. The Shermans fired first, shells ripping through the lead truck. It erupted in flames, debris scattering across the road. Another shell smashed into the rear half-track, flipping it into the ditch. Machine guns opened from both sides. Daniel's Garand cracked, the familiar ping echoing through the trees as he dropped a German riding shotgun. Panic spread through the convoy. Germans scrambled for cover, some diving under the trucks, others trying to return fire. A few jumped off the road into the creek and fell through the ice. Simmons yelled, they're moving for the ditch. Daniel reloaded, snow flying around him as bullets zipped overhead. A German MG set up behind a truck bed and started hammering their position. Simmons cursed, flattening himself behind the log. I see it, Daniel muttered. He waited until the gunner leaned out too far. One clean shot. The man slumped over the MG. Another German took his place. Daniel shot him too. The firefight turned brutal. The Germans, despite the surprise, recovered fast. Mortar shells from somewhere in the woods started dropping near the Shermans, sending plumes of white and dirt skyward. Flank team move, Miller's voice barked. Daniel and 3 others slid down the snowy slope, staying low, moving through underbrush until they reached the side of the convoy. A German officer was shouting orders from the cab of a truck. Daniel raised his rifle and fired through the windshield. Grenade, Simmons hissed. Daniel ducked. The explosion tore the side of the truck open, flames licking at the canvas top. Supplies, ammo crates, fuel drums scattered into the snow. Take the drivers out, Daniel yelled. 2 men sprinted between the burning trucks, returning fire. Simmons clipped one in the chest. Daniel dropped the second with a controlled burst. The Germans were pinned now, squeezed between the Shermans above and Daniel's flanking team below. Some tried to surrender, others fought to the last bullet. A round slammed into a tree beside Daniel's head, splintering wood into his face. He rolled, came up on one knee, and saw a German crouched by the creek with a Panzerfaust. RPG, Daniel shouted. The German fired, the rocket streaked toward the ridge. It hit the Sherman dead center, the blast blew the turret half off, flames gushed from the hatch. Daniel felt the shockwave rattle his bones. Jesus Christ, Simmons yelled. Keep pushing, Miller roared over the chaos. Daniel's hands shook as he reloaded. One of their tanks was gone. If the second went, they'd lose the high ground. He sprinted forward, sliding down behind a burning truck. A German tried to stab him as he came around the corner. Daniel caught the man's arm, slammed his rifle butt into his jaw, then shoved him into the fire. He didn't look back. The second Sherman roared, its gun booming again. Another truck exploded. Snow, mud, fire, and screams tangled together in one chaotic storm. Finally, after what felt like an hour but was probably 15 minutes, the gunfire began to die. Germans dropped their rifles, hands up. Others lay still in the snow. Daniel leaned against the wrecked truck, chest heaving, ears ringing. Simmons stumbled up beside him, blood streaking his cheek. "You still alive?" "Yeah," Daniel spat into the snow. "Barely." Miller appeared through the smoke, limping slightly. "We got it," he said hoarsely. "Convoy down." The men began securing the area, pulling ammo crates out of the snow. Some of the fuel drums were still intact, a gold mine in this frozen hell, but the victory was expensive. They'd lost 1 Sherman, 4 men dead, 7 wounded. Daniel walked up the ridge and looked down at the road. The snow was black with soot. Bodies lay scattered like broken toys. It smelled like diesel and blood. Simmons came up beside him, silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, "You ever get the feeling we're just surviving, not winning?" Daniel didn't answer right away. "Winning, for people back home. Out here, we just don't die today." Simmons nodded slowly. Miller joined them, scanning the horizon.